This is going to be an interview on Google Hangouts on Air. And so I'm very excited today to have Chris Wiggins, who's an associate professor at Columbia, and he's also the chief data scientist at the New York Times. And we're doing it Google Hangouts on Air. So you're seeing this if you're watching at 11:30 on June 1st, you're seeing it live. If you have any questions, you can tweet at me at @simplystats, and I'll try to ask those at the end of the interview. We have about a half an hour, and so I have a few questions I'm going to go through, and then if you have other questions, we're happy to take them. So, Chris, thank you very much for joining us.
Cool, sure. Thanks for inviting me.
And so the first question that we have, we always ask all our interviewees is, do you consider yourself a data scientist, a statistician, I guess in your case, a computational biologist, or something else?
All of it. So I was just on this panel at the Royal Statistical Society, and I think Zubin Garamani was the one who used the phrase social construct for all of these fields. So, you know, I tend not to be very disciplinary. You know, I'm a computational biologist who applies machine learning as an applied mathematician, and my PhD was in theoretical physics. So I don't have a strong tribal allegiance to any particular discipline. I definitely think I'm more of a data scientist than I am a statistician. And I say that based on sort of the historical arc of statistics. You know, as much as I've read about the history of statistics, I think with the exception of heretical statisticians like John Tukey or Leo Breiman, the things that I'm interested in and the things that I tend to consider mission accomplished are more like the things that data scientists are doing than the things that statisticians have done for most of the last century.
Okay, and so that's a good question. I think that's something, certainly a debate. I consider myself a statistician. There's a debate in our community about what is statistics.
That's right.
Maybe it'd be similar. I feel like a lot of my mission accomplished things are, you know, creating a data product or finishing a piece of software or a visualization or something, which maybe is more data scientist than statistician as those definitions go. So yeah, I saw a recent interview, I think it might have been at the Royal Statistical Society, where you talked about data moments, where a field goes from not having data to all of a sudden having data. And so do you think that this is something that's happening a lot across different fields? What's a data moment?
Yeah, in part, ultimately, it's a change about mindset rather than tool set. But so for a lot of people, the future comes slowly, and then it happens all at once. So in biology, you know, a part of it is just my own historical perspective. When I started graduate school in 1993, biologists were not so interested in people doing mathematical modeling. And then by the time I finished my PhD in 1998, they were hugely interested in talking to anybody who had experience looking at data. So that, you know, to the extent that 5 years is a moment, that sort of felt like a data moment. And for me, there was one moment when a friend of mine came in to lunch with some other graduate students, and he was holding Science magazine, and it had the image of the genome of Haemophilus influenzae on it. And all of us were just like, wow, you can have the entire operating manual for a critter. You know, like that's allowed for, like, you're trying to understand this critter for a couple of centuries, and then somebody hands you the entire user's manual for that critter in a language you didn't choose, and there's sort of no model to compare it to. Like, there's no distribution to run a test on or anything. It's just like, you know, a couple of phone books worth of information. So that definitely felt like a data moment. I think it happens more and more because more and more communities have sort of the change in mindset that goes with it. So like in baseball, when you think about, you know, nowadays sort of there's data science and everything, but in early days people would talk about Moneyball as being an example of people applying data somewhere where it just felt like it shouldn't be allowed to be applied, right? But you had this very active society of amateur baseball researchers who were compiling all of these statistics about everything they could compile in baseball. Eventually, people started charging for that. So you got, you know, sort of obsessive baseball record keeping as a service. And then not long thereafter, people started realizing, okay, maybe we could put these data to work by, for example, valuing players and trying to learn what a player should be worth based on just a whole lot of quantitative metrics rather than gut. So that was an example where the data moment wasn't so much in a change in technology, although there was sort of technological advances. It was really the change in mindset of a community to be like, yeah, you know, we can win the pennant if we're willing to take a much smarter approach to optimizing the value of our players given our finite, in this case, financial salary cap resources.
And so do you think that, I mean, so you mentioned that you were in computational biology and now you're chief data scientist at the New York Times. Do you feel like journalism, I mean, it seems like with Nate Silver and all of that, that there's been sort of a data moment for journalism. Do you feel like that's true? And do you feel like, when did that feel like it happened for you or for the field? And do you think they're handling it well, or, you know, everybody handles it differently, right? So how do you, that's a big question.
So there's several data moments sort of that have been happening at the Times. I think, you know, the one around Nate's work when he was still at the Times in the 2012 election was a real moment for sort of rhetorical literacy and critical literacy in data. Meaning, you know, there's a real advance that part of the news that's fit to print is helping people understand more deeply the quantitative reasoning behind election forecasting and what polls really meant or didn't mean, and what the opinion of experts meant or didn't mean. And that requires a lot of rhetorical literacy and how to think about data. Along with that revolution, which I think has now been really sort of made permanent with the creation of a group called The Upshot at the New York Times, there's been a real change in the functional literacy with data on the business side, which is what we call everything that's not editorial. Okay. So my group is definitely doing things in collaboration with editors, and there's at least one member of my group who's actually embedded in the newsroom. But a lot of what we're doing is things that are straight up operations research or predictive analytics applied to understanding what our subscribers like or don't like about our products. There are things that could happen at any content company that are not necessarily data journalism. They're more applications of the functional literacy of data science to solving real and present business problems.
You feel like, because it seems like you were in computational biology, I've noticed a lot of, I'm also in genomics, computational genomics, and I've noticed that there's a lot of people that are moving from that field into sort of data science roles like yours. Do you feel like there's something about, was it just the maturity of data science and genomics that made it natural to transition people like you into data science positions at, you know, media companies and so forth?
That's a great question. I think computational biology shares a lot with amateur baseball statistics in that we have systems that we're interested in that are complex but clearly not random. Like there's clearly logic there. And part of it is technology, like just the technological advances around biology have been so high impact with respect to the data that are available for the last 20 years. I mean, starting with genomics, the sequencing genomics, immediately thereafter with functional genomics, which is what people used to call microarrays. At the turn of the century, there were all this works on protein-protein interaction networks, all sorts of revolutions in sequencing technology, including sequencing in order to measure expression, and just the sort of data empowering revolutions of biology have just been, like every 6 months. In early days, we were talking about this curve of like a Moore's law decline in the price of sequencing, and then something happened that actually like even beat its own expectations for how cheap it was to sequence things. So, biology has had just all of these technological revolutions in the last 15 years around data collection. Also, the stakes are really high. I mean, people really want to understand these systems, and it really matters, particularly as you think about translational biology. A lot of the things that we learn about yeast help us understand mutations in general, cell cycling in general, human health as well. So there's just a lot of people interested in trying to make sense of these data.
And so you think that, I mean, it seems to me that a lot of the skills carry over. You mentioned complex, but clearly not totally random. Like there's some signal to be had there. I imagine you run into similar sorts of problems at a media company. You mentioned you treat it sort of like a media company. You're part of the data science team there at New York Times. And I imagine there's some similar, you see similarity in problems there?
Absolutely, and the similarities are not just in the sort of the machine learning aspects. So the aspects of trying to understand a complex system through abundant data are ones for which the machine learning part of data science are very helpful. And in particular, I'm a big fan of supervised learning because I know if I'm wrong. So, when I'm trying to predict if genes are going up or down, or I'm trying to predict, what's going to happen to a particular subscriber, if it's a prediction problem, then I can either leave out some of the data, or I can wait and do the experiment and see how bad my model is. But the other thing that's in common, I think, is the sort of data science part, where you are listening to a business owner or a person who may not know statistics or calculus or whatever, and you're trying to think about how to reframe their question from the real world as a machine learning task, do the machine learning, and then interpret the result of that modeling task in a way that actually benefits somebody else. So that's a part that I think is very common between working at the New York Times or working with computational biologists. Like biologists are smart people who have been working for centuries to understand complex systems, and they have their way of understanding it, which until around 20 years ago was not incredibly data driven. And that's true also for editorial people or for people at the New York Times that are in product or marketing or advertising. They definitely have like a way of understanding the world that's been honed for a long, long time, but it's not necessarily a way that is expressed in terms of high-dimensional statistics or predictive analytics.
Right. And so do you think that it seems like you're talking there, and I think I definitely agree with you, that the communication skills that you learn about communicating with people who are non-technical, those you feel like those carry over from one, even though you're talking about, I guess, something different, biology versus, say, content prediction algorithms, the abstraction of talking to somebody about data in a non-technical way, that carries over?
Yeah, the communication skills, I think, do carry over. I think you need to, I think part of this also comes with being a professor. You have to think really hard about how you're going to communicate a technical subject to somebody who's not necessarily a technologist. The other thing that I think carries over is the task of knowing the right tool for the right job. So, like, the world doesn't hand you distributions, right? The world hands you observations. And the world doesn't tell you, what Hamiltonian to diagonalize or what distribution to perform what test with respect to. The world just hands you, problems and data. And so there's a real creative task to either understand what is the right tool for the right job or to come up with a new tool that's appropriate for that new problem. I do think that statistics, and again, to invoke this historical strain of heretical statisticians, I do think that within statistics, there's this very applied tradition of people like Tukey, who was doing election forecasting, and he was working with educational testing services. He was spending a lot of time in the real world driving his problems, or Leo Bryman, who walked away from this position at UCLA as a proper mathematical probabilist, and probabilist is
that's a technical definition.
Right. People outside probability sometimes call probabilist probabilist. So Bryman sort of left that high church mathematical tradition and spent a couple of years doing consulting work, and that led us to CART and random forest and all these other innovations. So I do think that within statistics there is this very applied tradition of going out into the world, finding real people with real problems. They have real data that may be collected in ways that you wouldn't have designed or have errors that you may not have anticipated, and you work with them to figure out how their problems can be reframed as an existing tool or make up new tools that are the right ones to advance that field.
Right. I think certainly I'm in a biostatistics department, and that's the sort of the bread and butter of the biostat department, is doing that exact task. You work with people, you get messy data, you figure out what's the question you're trying to answer, and then eventually build it into maybe some models. So a question I had, and this is related to a question we got online, is what are the things you look for if you're hiring, say, somebody for your team of data scientists? What are the sort of qualities that you look for in students coming out or people that are professionals that are applying to work with you?
Mm-hmm. So, I think in 2015 people are starting to appreciate that data scientist could mean a bunch of different things. Right. People are starting to talk about data engineering, data DevOps, data science as sort of separate skill sets. Our group at the New York Times has grown to the point where, in early days, the basic needs were some amount of data engineering and some amount of machine learning and predictive analytics and the ability to communicate that. Now we have a group that's matured enough that there are people who do fancy graphical models, there are people who stand up simple prototypes in Flask, which are very useful for getting people to feel like they can interpret what your machine learning does if they have some sort of interactive prototype they can deal with. And also people who are really good at deploying data products at scale and understand the sort of the corner of DevOps that's associated with jobs that run in recurring ways on new data sets and can be trusted by the rest of the company as infrastructure. So at this point, I'm looking for a more diverse set of technical skill sets as this data science group grows out in maturity. In terms of like human qualities, I definitely look for people who are good listeners and good communicators, and who have sufficient breadth in their machine learning or statistics to know what the right tool is for the right job.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I guess an interesting thing that came out of the recent U.S. COTS conference on teaching statistics was there was a big emphasis in statistics classes in pushing people to look at more messy data and have skills with messy data. Do you find that the skills that you're looking for tend to be those sort of low level, lack of a better word, sort of technical skills of crunching bad data sets into tidy data sets that then you can do stuff with? Or do you look for sort of artistic creativity in the ability to apply the right machine learning task, or is there a balance? And I guess it probably depends on the role, right?
Yeah, I think there are plenty of data science jobs for which data munging and data tidying are really needed. Personally, I'm a big fan. I've spent a lot of time over the last couple of decades at the command line with SEDOC and grep and trying to clean and find errors in biological data. A happy fact about the New York Times is most of the data we're analyzing is data that we produce. So, like, if we're analyzing web logs, it's data that we created and curated, and so there's not so much time here spent on sort of data cleaning. There are really interesting data pathologies, but fortunately, we sit alongside the data engineering team, so we're only about a meter away from the people who know where the data pathologies are. And like, if there was a bunch of ill-formatted JSON in February of 2015, they know that and they know why and things like that. So for my particular group, the sort of data tidying skills are less of a bottleneck. But I do look, getting back to what I look for, I do look for people who have a lot of self-criticality. One thing that I've said before about graduate school is, if you spend 5 years and you're working 40 hours a day, you do the math, and over like 50 weeks, that's 10,000 hours, right? So 5 years in graduate school is enough time for you to think you understand something, realize that you've completely fooled yourself, acquire a much deeper level of confusion, and then after 5 years, you really attain enlightenment on some small project. Right? And the process of that sort of trough of despair is very useful for getting people not to trust themselves when the graph looks right. Right, so you do some data, hoo-ha, and then you make this graph, and your advisor says, "Yep, looks good." You need some sort of self-criticality before you just rush to publish. Right? You need to really think through, am I fooling myself somehow? Just because the data look right doesn't mean that you've really understood, or even that you've chosen the right method for the right job.
Right. Yeah, I think skepticism, it gets talked about a lot around here, at least at Hopkins, about how influencing people to have the appropriate level of skepticism in data. Identifying, okay, it looks cool and all, but we got to check all these 100 things before you are sure that this is a real pattern.
So the expert is the person who's made every mistake possible in the field. And one of the things that I look for is people who have been doing this long enough that they've probably made a lot of mistakes and have the self-skepticism that comes along with that.
Right. One of the questions we got from online from Twitter was a question about managing data teams. So you're managing a team now. Do you have have you learned any lessons about managing a data science team that you think are general ideas you've learned about whether it's specialization of people that you need to hire, or how you organize where people sit, or anything like that you've learned about managing and organizing data scientists?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know how much this generalizes. My personal experience is that I run the group at the New York Times a bit like I run my academic group, which is a lot of mission orders rather than tactical orders. So it's just not practical for me to sit down and tell everybody which library to use for every process. But everybody knows a set of high-level things that I value. Like, if they make an arbitrary parameter, they know that I'm going to ask them how to justify that parameter. If they quote me a number about how well the model's doing, they know that I want it to be on held out data or equivalently test error rather than something else. So there are some high-level principles that get drilled into people. But yeah, I would say one thing I've learned about running a group is, both at the Times and at Columbia, I give people a lot of autonomy. And meeting with people is a lot like the style of direction is very similar between the two groups, because there's only 24 hours in a day, so I'm not going to be able to give people detailed tactical orders for every type of assignment.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. I think I've been hearing a lot more recently about how managing a sort of a research group is similar to managing sort of one of these groups inside of social organizations or media organizations.
It is something I've thought about. In terms of where people sit, I've certainly found it helpful to sit next to the people who actually do the data engineering and who understand all the data warehousing for all the disparate types of data that the New York Times deals with. I think same thing in experimental science. You may do some analysis. In early days of microarrays, I remember, well, let's talk about lane effects, right? Like things that are in the news now, or in the news, like you have Lior's blog now, right? Like really thinking through how the data are collected can save you a lot of pain. So at least at the times, I found it very useful to be sitting as close as possible to the people who really understand how the data were collected and what sort of artifacts or sort of spurious covariates might be in there.
And then I guess I had a question that's more, I guess, personal to you, which is how do you balance the going back and forth between, it seems like you're doing both things at once. I don't know. I think that seems what's going on. And if that's true, how do you balance running back and forth between Columbia and New York Times?
Yeah, it's a lot of work. And I write a lot of shell scripts to send emails to save myself a lot of time. Okay. Every time I think about it, I keep thinking about John Tukey, how he was a full professor in statistics at Princeton. At the same time, he was like leading a research laboratory at Bell Labs. Nothing that I do could possibly be as difficult as that. The other thing is they're all very close to each other. So a benefit of New York City, and Manhattan in particular, is like everything is squished on top of everything else. So the New York Times is actually in between my apartment and Columbia University. So it's all on one subway line, basically. So if it weren't for that, I don't know if I would be able to get it done. But I mean, it's a lot. I mean, being a professor is a very manifold experience. You have to do a lot of different stuff, and somehow you make a mental path through all of it, in which it's one sort of coherent set of things to think about. So it's not easy. I think I haven't. I don't know. No Facebook, no Game of Thrones, no House of Cards, or anything else.
You read the New York Times?
I do.
Okay. That's good. You answered that one right. You won't get fired. So a quick question is, last question I had was, do you have any advice for students, for people who are just kind of new to the field of data science, or that want to get into it, things that they should definitely do, things that they should, be chasing down, just in general, any sort of advice for early career data scientists? We have a lot of the folks who read our blog, so.
I mean, general advice that you hear from lots of people is that it's important to just do it and find a data set that you're excited about, and then drill deep on that data set. Another piece of advice is to think through the whole value chain of obtaining the data, scrubbing the data, modeling the data, exploring the data, modeling the data, and interpreting the results, communicating it in a way to other people. And then a third thing, which I think is probably under-discussed, is to set a really high bar for what you do with those data, because I think amateur baseball statistics and blogs about computational biology have shown us there's a lot of ways that you can sort of torture the data until it confesses to anything, and you really need to have a high bar for understanding the principles behind what you're doing. One of the things I said in London is that the machine learning community has in some ways done a better job than traditional statistics of saying, like, here are some very general principles of how we learn from data, like supervised learning as a principle, reinforcement learning as a principle. And so I think you should look for, for example, the idea of optimization. Some of the things we do with data really are finding the optimal parameters under a restricted set of a particular loss function, possibly usually with some regularization term, thinking clearly about what optimization task you are really performing. I think is the sort of like high bar that you should keep in mind, rather than just allowing yourself to torture the data until you get a good p-value and then publishing.
Right. Great, that's very good. That's very helpful. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today. Everyone, if you have more questions for Chris, feel free to tweet them at me. I'm going to compile them and send them to him, and he can take a look and take a look and maybe seeing if there's any others. I think we've basically hit the highlights from Twitter and from me. And I know that it's been very entertaining and very interesting for me, so I really appreciate you taking the time, Chris.
Cool. Okay, thanks, everybody.
Thanks.